Thanks very much for having me, and a very special thanks again to the co-sponsors of the event, the Center for the Study of Women, and the Sociology Gender and Gender Workshop Group, and of course Julie Childers for setting this all up. So I'm very thankful to be here. I'm going to take you back for a moment to my first year grad school in 1994 at New York University. At the time, I was 24 years old, and there were two simultaneous processes that began. First, I embarked on 8 years of training in sociology, and second, I searched for a life partner in the Big Apple, arguably the mecca of all things fabulous and gay in North America. And so, in a certain way, these two things, my graduate training and my love life, commingled, if you will, for nearly a decade. And invariably, I think one came to inform the other, for better and worse. And it didn't take long before I became conscious of how the neighborhoods in New York City offered very distinct sexual scenes. And each of these scenes had their own particular socio-demographic composition and their own particular subcultural forms. In some cases, even moving from one block to another, or even from one bar to another, brought about a very dramatic change in the social landscape. And so I began thinking about the social organization of sexual life, meaning not just what individuals did in bed, but more the kinds of social worlds that they created around the search for partnership, whether that was a one-night stand or a marital partner, the whole gamut. It's largely on their appearance and maybe a bit of their affect, and these differences serve as the basis for one's social and romantic life. Now, over the course of my graduate studies, I discovered that actually there was very little by way of sociological analysis of power and prestige in sexual life. On the one hand, in the sociology of sexuality literature, sexual desire had been pretty much abandoned. It was ceded to a kind of inward-looking psychoanalysis, or it was left in the care of conceited French post-structuralists who would cryptically reduce sexual life to disciplinary power and expert knowledge, or worse yet, the unconscious. And on the other hand, when sociology had taken up the analysis of sexual life and taken it seriously, it tended to do so in very humdrum terms, in terms of rational action and social learning theories. And these theories have the problem that they typically make the very thing that we desire superstructural to the analysis. And they ignore the formation of sexual fields whereby our individual desires are aggregated into systems of sexual preference. So in my own work, I've began thinking about an alternative way forward. And I do this primarily by using Bourdieu's theory as a starting point, and I call this the sexual fields framework. Now, on this slide, you'll see some of the key concepts that I've been developing as part of the sexual fields framework, two of which I'll discuss today that are in blue, sexual field, and sexual or erotic capital. I'm going to refer to it as sexual capital herein, but the two terms are largely interchangeable in this emerging literature. And I'll touch briefly on number 6, structure of desire. But before I turn to the framework itself, I think it might help if I talked a bit about the historical context of sexual stratification, because I think the problem that I'm looking to address will become more clear to you if I do that. Many scholars in the sociology of sexuality literature note two defining characteristics of modern-day sexual life. One is autonomization, and two is specialization. So in terms of autonomization, scholars typically see that there have been broad macro-level shifts that have constituted the sexual domain as a domain in its own right. And those kinds of shifts include things like the expansion of capitalist markets, urbanization, women's changing socioeconomic status. So these together with other things like the birth control pill, the rise of sex-positive norms, modern transportation and communication technologies, all of these things together produce a form of collective sexual life that's relatively independent of traditional institutions of social control, like the family or the church. And the central insight is this, that whereas in the past our intimate lives were heavily organized by the hand of economic necessity, family alliances, arranged marriages, the pragmatics of reproduction, today it's really not quite that way. We pursue intimate relations in ways that are far less structured by outside stakeholders and institutions. And so this is why many scholars are inclined to see collective sexual life today as a domain in its own right, as having a certain degree of autonomy. There's also a related point to be made about autonomization, and that is most individuals today will spend a greater portion of their lives dating, searching for a partner, having sex with multiple partners, perhaps more than ever before. You could put it differently. Time inside the monogamous marriage comprises an ever smaller proportion of our sexual life histories. Why? Well, we have delayed marriage, we have high rates of divorce, which brings people out of marriage into the sexual marketplace. We have adolescent sexuality, which is perhaps more precocious than ever before. And we also have an expanding life for sexual seniors. So all of these things together make sexual social life, or what I call collective sexual life, an ever more salient feature of our lives, both in terms of the time that we spend in it and also what we can get out of it. Now, in addition to autonomization, our collective sexual life is increasingly specialized, whereby individuals operate within very particular subcultures that are built around ever narrower preference structures. You know this. You need to take a stroll around any urban center in the Western world, including Los Angeles, and you'll find evidence of very thriving, specialized sexual scenes, if you will, marked by distinct publics and highly specific partnership preferences. Certainly the virtual world makes the same point. So on the internet, think about the specificity of some of the sites you can find there. This is AsianFriendFinder.com. So if you're an Asian man or woman in search of an Asian partner, here you go. This month, apparently, the site boasts over 4 million members. Or maybe you're single and Jewish and you're looking for a Jewish partner. Welcome to JDate. Or maybe you're married and you're interested in having a discreet affair. Or you might be a single middle-aged woman and you're looking for a much younger man. Not for marriage, but for a good time. You are what some people would call a cougar. And here we've got cougar life. Or, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you could say, maybe you're a hairy, muscular gay man who would like to date a similar hairy, muscular gay man. There's BigMuscleBear.com for you. Here you have your choice of 2,967,526 pounds of bear muscle. And you can actually filter your search by the size of body parts. So you enter in the search screen things like not only height and weight and waist, but also the size of chest and arms. Okay, so here you get the sense of an ever narrower preference structure around which people are able to locate the partners of the desire. Or maybe you're sick of human beings altogether. I'm just about there myself. In which case you might join the furries, invoking Jean-Paul Sartre. Hell is other people. The furries are humans who are dressed in animal suits who meet throughout North America in conventions for those who have a friendly or romantic interest in furries. And if you see yourself as a gay furry, don't worry. There's a site for you as well. So the point is that late modern life is filled with both autonomous and specialized sexual communities that provide opportunities to meet all kinds of people for all kinds of intimate arrangements, from online sex to finding a spouse to finding someone in a teddy bear suit. But there's an important point to be made, and that is that collective sexual life is itself not an unfettered democracy, or a utopia, if you will, whereby all sexual desires and pleasures are realizable. In fact, far from it, collective sexual life is quite organized in ways that powerfully shape not just what we experience sexually, but the very life paths that we take and that are available to us. So not just who we date, but how we date them, when we date them, if we marry, how we think about marriage. For instance, consider the case of the newly divorced, heterosexual 40-something female who finds that opportunities to meet a suitable partner in her age category are far less than her male counterparts. Susan Sontag has labeled this phenomenon the double standard of aging. In fact, compared to men over 40, women over 40 are less likely to remarry following a divorce, and when they do remarry, they typically marry considerably older mates. So England and McClintock on this finding show that in every age category from 35 years on, women are more likely to be single than their male counterparts, and that by the time a man reaches his 60s, he tends to marry down 9 to 12 years in age. Okay, so that's an example of sexual stratification. Sexual stratification is also about our health and our well-being, including our emotional states that we experience in our day-to-day lives, and our ability to talk about and engage in safe sex. So as an example, Eisenberg finds that overweight college women are more likely to have sex while they're intoxicated, and more likely to have sex with a casual partner than their normal weight counterparts. Han finds that gay Asian Pacific Islander men typically lack desirability in urban gay worlds, and they find themselves in competition with one another for sexual partners, particularly for white men. So consequently, some of these gay Asian Pacific Islander men tend to relinquish control during sex with white men. They do this in order to secure the sexual encounter, and they're more likely than otherwise to engage in practices that put them at risk for HIV transmission. Murray and Adam find that older gay men are prone to what they call trade-off safe sex for an opportunity to have a sexual encounter with a younger man. So these are just a few examples of the impact of what I'm calling sexual stratification, whereby actors are differently valued within a given sexual milieu. So here, things like appearance, affect, body type, age, race, and class, all of these things serve to locate individuals in hierarchical relationship to one another. And they confer systematic advantages upon those who are deemed attractive, and systematic disadvantages upon those who are deemed unattractive. Those who are desirable gain the ability, again, to select a partner of their choice. They can develop more of an internal sense of locus of control. Social significance can come with being seen as very attractive within one's social group, and also easier group membership compared to those who are unattractive. By contrast, those who occupy a kind of low position in the sexual status order encounter obstacles to things like meeting a partner of one's choice. They may face invisibility or marginality in their sexual lives. And those things can bear on things like everything from drug use to sexual decision making. So my point is that I think there's good reason for sociology to take modern collective sexual life as a critical point of entry into a discussion about stratification. Okay, so with a bit of that historical context in place, I'm going to turn to sexual stratification as I observed it in my own research in Toronto, in a gay part of Toronto called Church Street, which is the main drag of the gay village there, and the place where most of the commercial gay establishments are located. Now, it just so happens that my apartment in Toronto is located just one block off of Church Street. How convenient. And this means that just to pick up a carton of milk or a loaf of bread, I walk past a string of gay bars, a string of lesbian bars, 2 bathhouses, a queer bookstore, 2 sex shops. And in these locations, gay men tend to congregate, and they take in the eye candy on the street as it walks by, right? God forbid you have a bad hair day. There's a lot of pressure to live there. But on these streets, there are other eyes as well, not just human eyes. And the eyes I want to talk about now gaze imperiously onto the strip. And they do this in 2-dimensional print form. Because on my way up Church Street for the carton of milk, the pathway is marked by advertisements for local gay bars and nightlife events that are on every street pole, fire hydrant, newspaper rack, whatever they can be stuck on, it is. So between 2005 and 2009, every month I would take my camera down to the strip and I would compile a photographic collection of everything on the street level related to advertisements or some kind of signage. And I did this in a 4-block radius at the center of the gay village. And here are a few of the typical examples that I found. This one always caught my eye. You'll see it says, "Don't come home without it." And what have you got there? You've got 3 young shirtless white men side by side. Here's another one. These are really typical, by the way. These are not sort of cherry-picked. I have hundreds and hundreds of these. The telephone poles are often wrapped with things like this. These posters announce various upcoming bar events. So here, for instance, is a poster for Alibi, which is a gay bar that caters to mostly white men in their 30s and 40s. Now, this poster, like all of the signs on the block, features as bait a handsome, college-aged, lean, muscular, shirtless, white, Abercrombie & Fitch type guy laying in bed, looking longingly at passersby. Maybe he's asking, "How do you like your eggs?" It's not entirely clear. And then we see that there is the infamous $4 brunch, which seems to signal that something other than eggs is on the menu if you attend Alibi. So from a sociological vantage point, Church Street is something really miraculous. It's an unapologetic, sex-positive queer space. It's dressed in rainbow flags from head to toe. And like most of Toronto, the gay village actually has a very diverse race, class, and gender presence. And yet, if you look at the street advertisements, Church Street is not itself a space of limitless possibility. In fact, the uniformity of these kinds of representations communicates something to those that are walking down the street. It communicates that this is a social space marked by a very particular kind of ideal of male attractiveness that revolves around very specific race, class, age, corporeal, and affective characteristics. And this phenomenon, of course, is by no means limited to Church Street. In the day-to-day life worlds of most modern cities, there exists a kind of social structure that's organized by attributions of desirability. What I'll argue today is meaningfully thought of as a kind of Bourdieusian field. Now, at this point in my talk, I think it's important probably that I'm going to use the word desirability a lot. And I want to clarify exactly what I mean by desirability. I'm not really talking about, no, let me rephrase that. I am not talking about individual desires. Individual desire, like any other instance of taste, is a very messy affair. Tastes in food, in clothes, in sex are very hard to predict, and they're subject to an endless amount of variation between people. But one doesn't need to explain individual desire to talk about collective desires, as these are expressed in patterns of partner choice, in social esteem, and in representations of desirability. This is because at the level of collective life, those individual desires and attitudes about desirability are consolidated and aggregated up to constitute what John Levy Martin calls hegemonic systems of judgment. Now, these hegemonic systems of judgment establish a collective definition of what is desirable and what is not. And in this sense, they operate irrespective of any individual's desire. These systems of judgment are institutionalized in the sexual field, in patterns of interaction, in advertisements that tell us who is desirable and who is forgettable. They're also discernible in bars and nightclubs at the micro level. Look at the bartenders, look at the go-go dancers. Who are the folks represented in videos that may play throughout the venue? In many gay bars, as an example, porn plays on the video screen and provides very explicit representations of idealized bodies and idealized sex acts. So these hegemonic systems of judgment, as Martin and George call them, require individual actors to deal with them in order to play the game, or to play the field, if you will. So taking a macroscopic view, these desires, when they're collectivized, are patterned to the extent that they incorporate schemes related to race and class and gender, age, and nationality. And in that sense, they tie sexual life to broader societal constructions. So if, for the moment, we suspend the issue of the idiosyncrasy of our individual desires, and if we focus instead on collective desires and appreciations, we find ourselves confronted with a very interesting problem of order for sociology. And now the question is, how do we make sense of that order? How do we make sense of these collective sexual desires? And what are their effects for the social order? And this is where I turn to field theory. In sociology, I'm sure many of you know, field theory has had its greatest impact in the work of Pierre Bourdieu's study of the routine practices of social life. So for Bourdieu, the social landscape is organized by these interrelated yet autonomous fields. He writes, each field prescribes its particular values and possesses its own regulative principles. These principles delimit a socially structured space in which agents struggle, depending on the position they occupy in that space, either to change or to preserve its boundaries and form. So fields, whether they're political fields or economic fields or fields of cultural production, they're arenas of social life that I like to describe by using two metaphors that Bourdieu and others invoke. I like to think of fields as combining these two metaphors, the metaphor of a force field and the metaphor of a battlefield. Let's take number one, the force field. So fields are a bit like a field of gravity or a magnetic field. And the idea here is that each particular field has its own particular logic that establishes a kind of gravitational pull that brings into alignment otherwise diffuse attitudes, practices, and sensibilities. So in this sense, fields orient and make orderly those elements within its scope. The second metaphor is a battlefield, and you can think here of a battlefield or an athletic field. And within the field, actors vie for esteem, for field significance, and for the field's rewards, whatever those rewards may be. They may be fame, they may be money, they may be the ability to attract partners of one's choice. So field actors are located within fields, within social space, relative to one another. And they are disposed to redefine the boundaries of that field in order to improve their position in social space and reap its rewards. And this gets us to the concept of capital. Capital is a kind of field-specific resource. And in any given field, having the right capital and a sufficient amount of it increases the player's ability to command the field and to obtain its rewards. So turning to a sexual field, I define the sexual field as a discrete, institutionalized sphere of relations that orients actors' desires and where an actors vie for partner choice, social significance, and esteem. Okay, the sexual field emerges when actors' desires develop in relation to one another and to the logic of desirability within a given physical or a virtual space. And I call the physical or virtual spaces of sexuality sites. Okay, so I'm arguing today that I think it's useful to consider collective sexual life as captured by these two metaphors of the field, both in the sense of a force field that orients desire and a battlefield of organized struggle. And here now thinking about the most important sociological insight that I can offer today from the sexual fields framework. And that is really that we can't understand sexual life unless we begin to think about how attractiveness and desirability are themselves constituted within the sexual field. That is, these hegemonic standards of attractiveness within a field have the capacity to act back on individual desires and appreciations. In this sense, and this is the key, sexual fields are not just a place where sexual interaction happens. much more than that. A field is a place where desires are themselves shaped and constituted. So this is the heart of the kind of sociology of sexuality project that I have in mind. Because once we enter a sexual field, once an individual enters a sexual field, he or she enters the gravitational pull of that field. And his or her sense of what is attractive enters the jurisdiction of the social interaction and representation. And to a greater or lesser degree is transformed by those interactions and representations. So turning our attention back to Toronto and Church Street, looking at these kinds of representations, they give us a clue as to the status order of one particular kind of sexual field in Toronto. And they establish a very specific profile of desirability. All of the guys are roughly in their 20s. They're all white. They're all probably middle class if you look at the dentistry with the gleaming white teeth. They all have gym bodies. So there's a very particular profile of desirability that's articulated in these ads. And again, you see that relayed in the videos that play on the TV screens, the appearance of the bartenders, the guys who get to skip the line and walk in as VIP members. So you might imagine how the gay sexual field of Toronto produces very different conditions for like a working class man of color versus a middle class white man. Or maybe think about a 25-year-old white man walking down the street versus a 50-year-old white man walking down the street. So in this sense, one can think of these hegemonic standards of attractiveness as having a kind of structural form, wherein each field participant is judged and must in turn navigate that structure to play the game. And I call this a field structure of desire. And we can say that a structure of desire is hegemonic to the extent that it systematically confers desirability on some and not on others. Now, once institutionalized in the sexual field, structures of desire act like a field of gravity because they orient what actors think is desirable over time, and they bring into alignment what actors actually find to be desirable, either because they think this is what is desirable to other people, and we know what is popular in the eyes of our peers often becomes attractive to ourselves, or because our own sense of attractiveness gets socialized and transformed following exposure to a given structure of desire. Also, structures of desire set into motion comparison processes. You enter a field like this, players begin to compare themselves to others. Who's attractive? Who isn't? What representations say this is attractive and this isn't? And how do I fit into that? So actors are predisposed then to produce a theory concerning who's desirable and who is not. And they also produce a kind of plan of action regarding who is approachable and who is not, who's within their league and who is out of their league, how one should respond to another person's advance based on the social standing of that person and based on our own social standing. Okay, so with that in mind, let me turn to some of the key empirical and theoretical considerations that I want to talk about. And I'm just going to look at numbers 1 and 2. I'm going to focus on 1 and 2 for the moment. So these are the questions that are generated out of this framework. First, what is the relationship of sexual desire to the sexual field and sexual stratification? 2, what kinds of capital confer value in the sexual field, and why and how are these distributed across actors and with what effects? Now, as I've already indicated, for field analysis, individual desire is not as important as collective desire. And collective desires are transmitted to actors through representations and also through observing patterns of interaction in a given milieu. So actors acquire power in the sexual field through this collective construction of desirability. And the way in which that desirability is embodied, we can think of as is through sexual capital. Sexual capital is a resource composed of those physical attributes, affective characteristics, and sociocultural styles that are favored within a field and elicit a desiring response in others. So the more that a given field is organized to facilitate sex and sexual partnership, the greater the significance of sexual capital for establishing one's position in the field. And as I suggest here, there are three components that we can think of when looking at sexual capital. We can think of the body, we can think of affect, and we can think of sociocultural styles. So these characteristics like height and weight and dress are saturated with cultural meaning in a manner that constitutes them as a kind of social artifact and not just an essential object of desire. Now here's one of the interesting implications of a theory of sexual capital. And that is this, that sexual capital may accrue to an individual based not on their actual desirability, but on what others think is collectively desirable. So meaning that to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the field in question, the sexual capital of an individual is based not always and only on the first order desire of actors, but also on the way that those actors, the things that they think are desirable or are popular within the field as a whole. And so this insight gets us to consider how the very things that we deem desirable in a partner arise in part as a field effect. So let me give you a quick example to make this concrete. Elizabeth Armstrong conducts a really interesting study of sexual life at a large state university. And she finds that within Greek life, a sorority sister's sexual capital was not simply the product of men's desire, but also in part the product of the sister's reputation with her other sisters. So specifically, some sorority women were labeled sluts by their sisters. And these women subsequently lost favor, not just with the sisters, but with the fraternity men as well. So these men, in turn, grew less interested in dating the so-called sluts. And whenever sexual contact occurred, it occurred less frequently, and it was driven underground, on the DL, if you will. So in essence, the sluts lost sexual capital even when their actual sex appeal may have been quite high among the fraternity men. So in this sense, it becomes important to think about sexual capital as not just a function of first-order sexual desirability, but also as a function of what others think is desirable within the field. Now, because I look at gay sexual fields, in a certain way I'm looking at the ideal case when I work, because a gay sexual field typically represents a kind of pure sexual field, if you will, wherein sexual capital is the chief source of social significance. But if we think more broadly about desirability within a sexual field, we also have to think about how other capitals, such as economic capital, cultural capital, human capital, how these things can also bear on status. So for example, in many heterosexual dating fields, women may find men who have job security and financial power to be quite highly desirable. These are highly desirable characteristics in a partner. And in this sense, it's helpful to think of fields as catering to capital portfolios, particular kinds of capital portfolios, which I try to represent in this figure. So here we have the relative importance of capitals across sexual fields. And I give you, in the boxes, 3 different kinds of sexual fields. A marriage mixer, which is just a way of signaling a kind of sexual field where people are very interested in finding long-term or marital partners. And then you have the speed dating, kind of recent urban phenomenon where people meet for a few minutes, and have a series of quick dates to find out if anyone is interested in them or if they find anyone else interesting. And then at the bottom you have a gay bathhouse, which is probably the sexual field that's most based on sexual capital alone. Now this figure can be made even more nuanced if we added in gender. So for instance, research has shown that compared to men, women care a little bit less about sexual capital, but more about economic and human capital in selecting a partner. So in that sense, we can say that these capital portfolios will systematically vary between men and women to a greater or lesser degree. We also might want to consider how desirable capital portfolios change over time for men and women. In this figure, I'm using some data by Bourdieu and colleagues published in 2001 regarding mate preferences over a 50-year period. So, here what we see is that among heterosexual US men and women, on average, women are still valued much more for their sexual capital than their economic capital, but a little bit less so over time. Conversely, men are still much more concerned with, men are still much more valued for their economic capital than their sexual capital, but that's somewhat less over time. So the capital portfolios of desirable partners between the sexes, in a way, are becoming a bit more alike over time, though of course there's still real significant differences. We could complicate this figure and specify even further distinctions by race and class. For instance, among working class or poor African Americans, we might see much less of a gendered distinction, or maybe even a gendered reversal in the desired capital portfolios of partners. But the general point remains, which is that partner desirability is tied to these capital portfolios, which vary in the degree to which any given capital is valued. Okay, so let me move to a discussion of what I see as 4 interconnected levels of analysis that bear on sexual stratification. And I'm going to start from the bottom up. So looking at sexual life is really complicated because there are all of these levels one needs to deal with. Both, even looking at the very bottom at sort of these intrapsychic sexual desires, maybe even merging into the unconscious. There is a role for that, I think, in thinking sociologically about sexuality, although how we can get at the unconscious is itself a methodological quandary. But starting at the bottom, we find that individuals have very particular kinds of sexual scripts, we can call them, specific objects that they find desirable, types of people distinguished by race and by class and by gender, by ethnicity, by age, ability, affect, on and on. Moving up a level of analysis, we are looking at the micro level of interaction, maybe interaction in a nightclub or a coffee shop or in a chat room. This sphere of interaction is what we can think of as sexual social structure in the making. And here, the person that approaches the micro-level order will want to ascertain what is the dominant system of judgment and appreciation that defines sexual capital in the field. What is the structure of desire? And this is done in part by observing the talk among patrons in a given bar or site regarding who is desirable and who is not. In observation, who is paid attention and who is ignored? Who initiates conversation and how? Who is rebuffed by whom? What are the representations of attractiveness in the advertisements for the website or for the physical venue? Now, once the structure of desire is identified, the analyst of the field will want to consider how that structure of desire may act back on desires and desirability itself. And in this sense, then, you want to start thinking about attributions of attractiveness, these collective attributions of attractiveness, as in part field effects. And also at the micro level, I found a lot of Goffman's social psychology to be very helpful here in thinking about how sexual actors need to be mindful of their self-presentation and manage the self and jockey for position in light of different sexual status. It's also important to think about how sexual fields can vary in terms of the institutionalization of the sexual status order. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about sex in a public restroom or park, or the dark room of the bathhouse. That may have a very low institutionalization of sexual strata. In those settings, virtually anyone with a pulse will suffice for sexual interaction. Whereas Friday night at the swanky martini bar on Wall Street may have a much greater kind of institutionalized erotic stratum and operate with a very particular currency of sexual capital. Now, at a greater degree of abstraction, any given neighborhood can constitute a sexual district with multiple sexual fields of varying character. And in total, we might say that the relation of these fields to one another is part of the analysis of collective sexual life, part of the analysis of what we could call a sexual district. And finally, moving all the way up at the broadest, most macro level of analysis, sexual fields are shaped by social, political, and economic processes, including local configurations of commercial and public space, the culture of neighborhoods, local economies, local and federal policies related to sexual regulation, patterns of immigration, gentrification, urban renewal. All of these things bear on the composition of and structure of the sexual field. So the study of the sexual field is subject to kind of the full scale of sociological analysis. And I think it will require attention at each of these levels, from the intrapsychic all the way up to the macroscopic, to understand. Okay, so with the end of my talk nearing, let me just offer you a quick review. To the problem of sexual stratification, I offer the sexual fields framework. Now, time has really limited the degree to which I can give you a sufficient rendering of this framework. So today I've just given you a bit of a flavor for the framework, and I've talked a bit about the concepts of the sexual field, sexual capital, and a little bit about structured desire. The framework has other components, I think, that are also very useful. And it's my belief that today, collective sexual life, and maybe in the past century, makes this pursuit of intimate relations a very significant proportion of the modern life history. We spend more time being single, and we have many more options for intimate life than we ever did before. Sexual life, nevertheless, is organized by these sexual fields that each possess their own particular status order. Here, desirability in the field is not democratized, but rather is stratified. And once someone enters the jurisdiction of the sexual field, desires are brought into alignment and a sexual status order takes form. The valuation of desirability is not to be taken as an essential part of our desire. It is rather a combination of things, and part of the sociological aspect that's interesting is the way in which the field actually shapes what we find desirable. So as I've argued today, field analysis suggests that desire itself is in part shaped and constituted by the very fact of the field, including its capacity to socialize desire by establishing these collective systems of judgment or structures of desire that tend to bring into alignment what are otherwise diverse desires across individuals. And I'm going to leave that there. Thank you.